I don't know or care about Anita Sarkeesian. I don't mean that in a disrespectful or negative way. I mean that it seems like a lot of people are either rushing to her defense, putting her up at like VidCon as a speaker, or they absolutely detest her. I don't know much about her, to be honest. I just know she's a controversial figure who hosts Feminist Frequency, and I only have a peripheral understanding of her involvement with like Gamergate and things like that. But I still thought it would be interesting to talk about this news story from Hot Air, as well as her YouTube channel, and then I want to talk to you about my perspective on the issue from someone who doesn't know anything about what happened with her and Gamergate and all that based on what I see. While I wouldn't necessarily consider myself like an outsider on the issue, for the most part, at its core, I absolutely am, right? So, like a regular person on the street is going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have kind of a peripheral understanding of some of these things, but I want to make a greater point about I don't know, internal subculture conflict kind of stuff. But let's take a look at what's going on. So this is actually a bit relevant outside of any personal gripes people have with Anita Sarkeesian. Anita Sarkeesian did a series called Feminist Frequency, which they still host. And there have been some fake news stories surrounding her. And I think it was in 2014, I can't remember where. I saw a news report that claimed video games depicted things they actually didn't. And it was the setup for a story about Anita Sarkeesian. Again, I don't really have an opinion on her necessarily, but it was interesting to me that the news would publish misleading. This was like a major, I think it was like ABC News, published outright misleading information to prop up a narrative. The reason this is important is that at a certain time period, for those that aren't familiar with Anita or Feminist Frequencies, she was particularly influential with a lot of game studios and developers. That's my general understanding, in that she would consult and talk to them. And her videos were getting, I believe, a couple of them got millions of views. Again, I'm kind of an outsider on this. But this kind of symbolizes something different. That we may be seeing an era of a decline of certain personalities who grifted off of social justice. We're entering a different kind of era, though, because certainly in politics, and it's disconcerting. But it may be that the mass wave that sparked the culture war may actually be becoming less appealing to a lot of people. Or it could be that simply Anita Sarkeesian is no longer a relevant individual. But let's read this story. From Hot Air. Anita Sarkeesian's Feminist Frequency nonprofit is broke. They write, you may not recall Anita Sarkeesian, but she's a feminist critic who made a name for herself with a group of YouTube videos highlighting sexist tropes in video games. She's also received a lot of threats and made news when she canceled a talk in Utah over the fear that concealed carry permit holders would be allowed to bring their weapons into the venue. That same year, in 2014, Sarkeesian's Feminist Frequency organization became a recognized nonprofit, and as a result, she was required to file an annual report on the money she raised and spent. This is called a 990. Form 990s are available for all nonprofits that I believe are 501c3. I believe 501c. I don't want to get in the jargon. Let's put it this way. Some nonprofits that are tax deductible, 501c3 is what it's called, I believe their financials are all published. It's called the Form 990. You can Google it and you can see this. So I've done this background stuff on a lot of organizations, and I used to work for nonprofits, so I'm somewhat familiar with this. Because of this, we can actually see how much money they've raised and spent, and as it appears, they're broke. According to those reports, Sarkeesian's group, which had 2 employees plus a producer, has raised and spent about $1.6 million over the past 5 years. That's actually very, very, very small, okay? Small nonprofits, in my experience that I've worked with, like $1 to $3 million per year in revenue. But think about it. If you're paying for a studio space, if you're hiring staff, you know, these numbers might sound big to someone who assumes you have that cash in your bank to spend, but it's not really that simple. So, excuse me. So for Anita Sarkeesian, 1.6 million over the past 5 years, it's actually only a couple $100,000 per year. With 3 employees, they may be making a decent amount of money themselves, 6 figures. Hey, that's not bad. However, you also have to consider other expenses. They produce a show. They probably have some kind of space to pay for. So I wouldn't say they're personally hurting on terms of their salaries are still pretty good. But there could be some unseen expenses in terms of equipment to make the business operate properly. But let's read on. They say, but it seems that is coming to an end. A lengthy profile of Sarkeesian published by Polygon this week reports that earlier this year she laid off her 2 employees and stopped taking a salary. So we have an excerpt here that says, earlier this year, Sarkeesian decided that, that Feminist Frequency needed to change. She ceased taking a salary and laid off her co-creators and close friends Ebony Adams and Petite. She closed her offices and stopped making videos. Feminist Frequency is still going, but it's now mainly focused on a regular podcast hosted by Adams, Petite, and Sarkeesian. It's a purely voluntary organization. Sarkeesian has no pat answer to the question of why she's decided to move on. No, it was just time. The answers are more complicated. Partly it's about money. Fundraising is always a struggle, she says. Paying my staff is always a struggle. I'm capable of fundraising. I learned how to do it through the process of running a nonprofit, but I didn't get into this work to be a fundraiser. It's not a fun job, I'll tell you that. I used to do it. Feminist Frequency relied heavily on corporations willing to fund the sort of work that looks into intersectional feminist critiques of commercial art. When corporations make financial commitments to nonprofits, they like to make song and dance about their noblesse oblige, most especially when it portrays them in a positive light. But they're also prone to nickel and diming once favorable media coverage fades. Sarkeesian won't talk specifics, but it's clear that corporate generosity crept away once she outlived her usefulness. I believe that is the big point to take away here. A lot of what we saw with her being propped up and other people like her is the usefulness of positive press. Why would any organization make a donation? To make it seem like they're supporting certain issues. There's one problem. I don't care whether you like or don't like Anita Sarkeesian. I don't know much about her. I don't have a bad word to say about her personally, but I can say there was only one experience I had with her, and that was when I was at VidCon, and she spoke disparagingly to Boogie. If you're not familiar, Boogie is a very gentlemanly YouTuber, and he was considered a nice guy. They were on a bullying panel, and apparently afterwards she kind of bullied him. And this created a sort of a backlash because, it's one thing if you're mad at people who actually harass you. It's another thing to yell at a guy. At the time, I believe Boogie was wheelchair bound, and so he's somebody who got picked on, and here she was yelling at him. But also VidCon, which is the largest video conference, came to her defense when she, from the stage, insulted people in the audience because they had personal beef. Look, you're going to get people on the left saying Sargon rightly criticizes her. You're going to get people on the left saying Sargon and other YouTubers, harass. I don't know anything about that. I really, really don't. So from an outside perspective, I just see a woman on stage yelling at someone in the audience, and then I see a massive organization defending the person who started it. I get it. If you guys have a personal beef over some issues, you're both public figures. Welcome to the real world. All I can see is this woman yelled at Boogie, and all I can see is that VidCon came to her defense when she not only yelled at Boogie, but she also yelled at people in the audience. There was a mixture of clapping and booing. When I see that, okay, from an outside perspective, again, you might be saying, Tim, you're wrong. It's not what happened. Fine. I absolutely can agree. I'm probably wrong about the history of her and whether she's good or bad, but I'll tell you this. From an outside perspective, it's just volatile. It is a bad bet, and thus, when you have someone on stage yelling at someone for any reason, corporations are probably going to say, we don't want to be involved in that. When you're called out for yelling at a guy in a wheelchair, corporations are probably going to say, we don't want to be involved in that. People need to realize that ideology isn't always the defining factor for why action is taken. Why are certain organizations receiving funding? Well, it's actually quite simple. Not because their ideas are good. It's because Pepsi believes they'll make money by pandering to the masses. That's why they put pride rainbows on their logos for Pride Month. Not because they actually care about these issues, because it's socially acceptable. But not just socially acceptable, it's like social peer pressure. You have to do this to an extent. Like, are you going to come out in support of this community? Otherwise, people will wag the finger at you. So people probably, my assumption, gave Anita's Feminist Frequency some money in an effort to appear as though they cared about these issues. I will tell you what, though. At the end of the day, the people running these businesses care about one thing, and that's the green. Because when you have someone who cares more about ideology running a business, the business will go under. Look, if you have a business and the person is focused on sustaining that business by bringing in revenue, you bring in more than you put out so your business can grow, well, that's the focus you need to make the business survive. If your intention is to push an ideology, well, then start a nonprofit. The problem is someone's got to fund it. So here's what gets interesting. There was a tweet that earlier this month Anita Sarkeesian put out, kind of begging for money in a weird way. They say earlier this month, Sarkeesian noted that fundraising problems on her Twitter feed while taking a shot at electronic arts. Femme Frequency has been a nonprofit on the front lines of the issue for years, constantly struggling with funding. She said, am I going to have to learn how to play FIFA? Because Volta looks pretty awesome. Sorry, what? EA is donating $1 million to nonprofits working to end bullying and online harassment? Some facts. They didn't speak up during Gamergate at all. Feminist Frequency has been a nonprofit on the front lines of this issue for years, constantly struggling with funding. Just last week, Sarkeesian was seen offering her services to the creators of a forthcoming game, Cyberpunk 2077, on the grounds the game might get dragged by the whole of the internet for some potentially sexist representations. Cyberpunk 2077 is expected to be a big release. The game was introduced at E3 this year by Keanu Reeves, who plays a character in the game. So then we have this tweet where Anita says that she's available for consulting. So here's what I think happened. I think she became a toxic brand. She was shown to be volatile. And again, you might be saying I'm wrong, but this is what I know from an outside perspective, which means when it comes to anybody who might donate, they're going to be thinking similar things to me. Cursory glances, no idea what the subcultures are arguing about, just somebody who has been very divisive and has actually created controversy, not a good investment. So why would I bring that person on or donate to them? Probably not going to happen. Now, Anita says that they don't want to fundraise, but I believe the issue is actually she hasn't been successful in fundraising because as we can see on Twitter, she's trying to raise money for Feminist Frequency. They say that Feminist Frequency's annual report demonstrate that the group was down to its last $30,000 in January. But as the video below points out, the real problem isn't just a lack of corporate donors. It's a lack of public interest. The group has more than 200,000 subscribers on YouTube, but the average podcast it released this year only had a few thousand listeners. That's not much impact for a group that spent several $100,000 in 2018 on salaries and other expenses. The era of Feminist Frequency is over, and I'll make a few points. There was a time, it's my understanding, for those that are listening on the podcast, I'm here on the YouTube channel. Let's go to their oldest videos. There was a time where I believe they actually generated a substantial amount of viewership. We can see that 10 years ago, hundreds of thousands of views. In fact, 9 years ago, 1.1 million views. Now, so I did some reading. Some people said that there was originally another guy involved who was helping guide the kind of the tone and the narrative. And when he left, things kind of petered out for them. But his content is still successful, I believe. I believe he is an intersectional feminist. And we can see now that the current content they produce only gets a few thousand views, their podcast. But I will say one thing. It seems like they haven't figured out what they're actually doing. Some of the videos they've made that focus on specific issues actually got 40,000 views, but then they only made 3 of them and then kind of carried on. So I will say it seems like the organization is a bit dejected. They're all over the place. I mean, they're doing a Star Trek podcast. I think that's, Star Trek's great, whatever. I'm not sure what that has to do with feminism and Feminist Frequency. It seems like they got to a point where they just kind of wanted to do their thing, and this causes their channel to fizzle out and become kind of culturally irrelevant. So, I'll put it this way. I'm not sure if any of this actually mattered, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about my personal perspective. So I don't want to make this video too long. I'll talk about a few other points. I see a lot of people talk about Anita Sarkeesian, and I just don't know who she is or why she matters for the most part. I know she was influential early on in Gamergate with pushing the feminist narrative, so I can understand why people care. But it's interesting to me that this story popped up at all. Honestly, I read this and I thought, I saw this story and I was like, I don't care to talk about this. This doesn't mean anything to me. This is one random person who had a small business and their small business is going out of business. This is completely normal. I understand she was influential in the past. But I think this is a good example of symbols. People like to latch onto symbols for emotional vindication. So a friend told me this. When someone throws a brick through a Starbucks window, it's not because they actually think they're going to solve any problems. It's because it makes them feel good emotionally that they damaged the window of a Starbucks. They view Starbucks as an oppressive corporate system, so breaking that window makes them feel good. I think for the past several years, Anita Sarkeesian and Feminist Frequency have had zero relevance. They had relevance at 2013 and 14. Again, the way I see it, you may say I'm wrong, but I'm just coming from somebody who's an outside observer, sort of. I understand a little bit about this, and I just don't think she's had any relevance at all. Yet I've still seen people talk about her. And I think that's because she emerged early on as a symbol for what people were upset about. she was kind of the face of this wave of intersectional feminism coming into culture, and she still kind of is. So stories like this, for some reason, are still relevant to some people. I think one of the big issues with this video particularly, and I've been thinking about it the entire time I've been talking and before I even made it, is that I'm willing to bet there's going to be a ton of people who say, Tim, I have no idea who this woman is, and I don't know why I should care. And that's exactly the point. So if you find yourself as someone who has no idea who she is, and you're confused as to why I'm even talking about it, I'll put it simply. She was very influential in the spark of the culture war, in one of the more prominent moments in Gamergate. And people still hold her up as a symbol of the regressive left or intersectional feminism or of the grifter, social media grifter. And now she's broke. What that means, I don't necessarily know, but this is relevant to a lot of people. More importantly, I think her going broke is a symbol and perhaps a sign of the times to come. Keanu Reeves introduced Cyberpunk 77. It's a video game, and everyone loves Keanu Reeves. I think Keanu Reeves is fantastic. I don't think you're going to see people, bring the outrage to Cyberpunk. I think it'll be one or two Twitter accounts. You might get these woke news outlets then highlighting these Twitter accounts. But look, man, it's a popular game. You got Keanu Reeves involved, and I think that's it. So anyway, I can't believe I was able to pull off 16 minutes so far on this because I think it's such a niche issue, Nita Sarkeesian. And so I'll end by saying, I've talked about her in the past a bit. I mean, no disrespect to her personally. I don't know her. I have no issues with her personally and nothing like that. I would say to the people who really, really don't like her, it's time to move on. Admittedly, I think it's a small amount of people who are still obsessed with like who this woman is and what she represents. Again, just my outside perspective. So I'd say, who cares? Really, honestly, just who cares? I'm surprised Hot Air wrote about it, but I guess she was influential at such a point that it matters now to people that she's going defunct. Whatever, that's what I say. I mean, I don't wish failure upon people for the most part, so I can't really say anything to that. But I'll leave it there, because I could talk for a million years on the issue of this stuff. It's interesting. Feminist frequency is basically defunct at this point, and I guess that means something to some people. My next segment will be coming up at 4 p.m. on the main channel. For those on the podcast, you probably already heard it, but stick around. More stories to come, and I will see you all shortly.